62 suspected immigration offenders arrested. There were studies of local areas where people protested. You can't believe government statistics on immigration. Their campaign is to cause anxiety.
A couple of things that really struck me, and I'm sure others can chip in as well, about the resistance workshop was that this point about social media and street activism not being two separate things, but actually being very much interconnected. And then the ways in which we reach for counter-arguments, and I think this comes back to the sort of sanctions discussion just now. Rita talked about emphasising equalities, and I think that's a really pertinent point. In our session, somebody made the point that actually with the Med crisis, we shouldn't be referring to it as a migrant crisis, but rather as a humanitarian crisis. And that kind of takes us back to a point that's been running through the day, which is how often you use the word migrant and how often you use the word person or human, whatever. And then this sort of sense, quite a striking point by one particular activist academic, was that actually, are we becoming too polite in terms of the way we deal with issues? That people were flagging up that actually, we're not resisting enough. Somebody gave the example of wanting to let down the tires of an enforcement van, but thinking twice about it, and that as an indication that we're kind of pulling ourselves back, and along the sidelines there are a number of other bystanders that are doing nothing at all, and that was the sentiment that Rita expressed this morning as well. And this sense that actually we need to be reminded of our histories, that wherever people had gone out onto the street to have a conversation or in classrooms about those histories of colonialism or racism, etc., that had been quite productive. And somebody suggested holding a teach-in. We've been doing some sort of leafleting stuff with SBS on the street and had some quite productive conversations around that. So I think that's something to hold in mind in terms of thinking about going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, I just made a few comments just thinking about the day and relating it back to the project. And the first thing that strikes me is what's the significance of the last 2 years? Because the vans themselves were in the summer of 2013. And one thing which was interesting for me having meetings and interviews with policymakers was that in some ways I think they talked about this as a moment in time that had just kind of passed, and found it quite odd that we were doing a project focused on, or at least catalysed by something which only happened over the course of a couple of weeks one summer, and it was, oh, that was a sort of mistake and we've moved on now. And I think it's interesting just to reflect on what it means to do a project and that begins from that particular sort of moment in time and then moves forward. And one of the things that I suppose today has raised is how much has changed historically in the last couple of years and how much hasn't. And I think there are things such as the humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean is something which has featured today in a way that hasn't come up so much earlier in the project for some reasons. And I suppose just listening today to a lot of the presentations, I was struck with the thought that I think a lot of sociologists could get better at dealing with everyday acts of violence in a way, and to take seriously the kind of punitive dimensions of these contemporary forms of government. And that's why I thought Bridget's comparison to the issue of benefit sanctions is so important, because there have been times in the last 20 years of political sociology where it's become very focused on sort of soft forms of power, of norms and discourses and culture and this sort of thing. Whereas a lot of these forms of power are not soft at all. They're actually very punitive and quite violent. The second is the thought that I had was that just to say something more affirmative, there's been quite a few sort of more positive and affirmative things to say, but in some ways the project's called Mapping Immigration Controversies, but I think there's also a sort of celebrating immigration controversies to some extent that's going on here. Not in the sense that we want to celebrate all sides of these arguments equally, but to celebrate the fact that there is resistance, to celebrate the fact that there are voices that are being heard, because one of the things which I think keeps coming up in this project and what's come up over the course of the day is that facts of the matter are never quite enough, and that these are kind of political issues that don't seem to get settled easily with facts. And I think that's actually quite a positive thing in a way, and it's something where the government would likes to settle things with facts. That's how they settle economic controversies, trying to sort of dampen them with statistics and with facts. And that seems to be something which cannot happen in this area, because in some ways this is an issue which is not about expert knowledge, it's about mutual understanding. And that's something which I thought the conference today grasped very well, was that about the storytelling nature, the importance of storytelling, and something which I didn't expect the project to be so concerned with, which is performance. And the performances this afternoon, which involve questions of how do we appear to each other, how do we get judged by each other, and all this sort of thing. There was in some ways a kind of live staging of controversy over the course of the performances this afternoon. Just the final thing, which is a sort of source of hope, I suppose, sort of an issue of affirmation, is I think there's a sort of lot of pessimism and a lot of anxiety about the capacity of universities to do this sort of research at the moment. And I think, without wanting to sound sort of complacent or smug, I think at least it needs to be pointed out that this was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council with a huge amount of energy, mainly from Hannah, but it is still possible to do this sort of thing, and I think that's something which often gets forgotten in amongst all the pessimism of the Research Excellence Framework and the sort of, the very utilitarian obligations that are placed upon researchers today. So I just thought it's remarkable that this sort of thing can happen, and I think it will continue to be possible. The project itself, I don't know how many people know this, but it began with a few of us, instigated by Hannah in the summer of 2013, beginning to tweet about it. I think, was it on Twitter? And then we started to share emails, and so it began with a sense of sort of outrage, which then gradually, I think Hannah said, and there are ESRC urgent grants which can be applied to for this sort of thing. And I was pretty shocked, actually, that this was, the ESRC were willing to support this and in the way that it's gone. So I think there's a sort of source of hope in there that these sorts of things are possible. Maybe you could say some more, I don't know, but I think it's an interesting case study of how a research project comes about in quite a sort of heterodox and in the sort of way that you don't think that the social sciences are going at the moment. So.
I just feel like I really like to do kind of seat of my pants talk, so I couldn't pass up the opportunity to try and sum up the day just before Alex ends it in a more creative way. So some of what I'm going to say is going to repeat what Will was talking about, and I'll try and answer that last challenge as well. I think one of the things that's come up a lot during the day is, well, first of all, I wanted to say something about doing politically engaged research, which does engage with that. So all of the conversations we've been having in these sessions we're filming, and I'm thinking, what will the ESRC think? At least it's after the election period. But I think one of the things that we tried to recognise and and set out in our research proposal and throughout the research is that this is always political, so there isn't a neutral position on social life in general, but on these issues it becomes really clear. And so the idea of rational facts and the kind of the neutral is exposed in social science all the time, but in this case we tried to kind of recognise that and own it, and that is something that we found quite challenging to work with polling companies on in particular, which is another story. But I think that's something to bear in mind, that those kind of telling it how it is, rational facts, these are the numbers, is a particular form of emotive and emotional performance and produces emotions and emotional behaviours as well, and it isn't neutral and it isn't unemotional. And so engaging with that and recognising the commitments that exist has been an important part of all of the research we've done and the ways we've tried to share it. And I think it makes it hard sometimes to think about how you present that beyond sympathetic audiences, but I think that's a challenge to rise to. So that goes to that question around beyond expert knowledge as well. I think what we've thought, I think how we started out with the project, and it's become clear through today, and our focus has grown through the project on the need for that kind of gathering information, but also that part of doing engaged research and thinking with action, that, as Suresh said, is about treading a difficult territory between lots of spaces of contention. And some of the ones that came out today, which are quite key, I think, was the idea of the charities giving the perfect migrant story to a journalist. That exists, and how do you complicate that without undermining some certain things. But also the parallel with that is the performance that Maisie did, and then the critique of that as a stereotypical white working class voice. Those voices exist, but how do we complicate them and also recognise that that was what someone talked about? So the undeserving, and how do we pick that apart, the contrast between deserving and undeserving, while still taking seriously people's accounts and people's experiences? How do we do that without just collapsing into platitudes about common humanity? Obviously, there's a place about talking about we're all human and we're all the same, but that doesn't go very far when someone says, but okay, we're all human, but I don't want your TB germs on my children. How do we not dismiss that? So how do we've been talking about we, and we've been assuming a kind of shared set of values throughout this conference and the people that are engaging with this work. But there are people who disagree, but how do we engage with that without giving the ground to an assumption that people are basically racist and we have to be persuaded of the truth? Or how do we, so Gagi talked about creating in the workshop that she and Will run, about how do we kind of not assume that as the basis of how people are, but how do we do that without also, don't assume that the starting point is something about everyone is racist and have to be persuaded to behave well, but how do we also engage with the concerns and not create a racist other who is the person who asks us a difficult question, whereas we're comfortable to hear the stories and testimonies from asylum seekers about their difficult stories. So I think we haven't got any answers to that. But I think part of it is telling uneasy stories and having uneasy answers, and as Rita was saying right at the beginning, using humour, and part of that kind of making those connections is being able to do that with humanity and humour, and to think somehow about ordinary people. So to recognise ordinary people, the people that were giving their performances and talking about asylum stories, kept saying, look at me, I'm like a person like you. And I think that's slightly different from we're all human. It's about a personal connection, and it goes back to that emotive thing, which maybe is thinking about migrating people as well as and not migrating people, and also the people who are doing the everyday bordering are also could be you. It is some of us are doing everyday border control as university professionals. And then the final kind of challenge to all of that, of course, is the idea that Bridget also raised in that discussion. So Gagi and Will talked a bit about the stupidity of some of this performance politics that doesn't work. I mean, it's so ridiculous. Put that go home ban out there. Of course, it's going to make people be derisive about it and laugh at it. But Gagi's suggestion is maybe it is a distraction from that kind of everyday actual violence. And Bridget's comment was there's that stupidity, but there's also a kind of strategic humanitarianism of, we need to send boats back for their own good, or we need to let people drown so no more people will drown.
For their own good.
Yeah. An idea that, okay, we can, the things get co-opted. So there's a kind of thing to be wary there. But I think one of our findings, this thing which is also a research finding and also a possible campaigning tool, is to take that ourselves as well, to think about this idea of British values, to think about if we're having a conversation about what British values are, and then we're having people say, well, British values are tolerance, belonging, care. I don't see any of them in Britain for me. So maybe there's also kind of playing on those kind of questions. And just to finish off with the ESRC funded this, so it'd be great if you could all fill in your saying if there are ideas or actions that you might take away, so we can show that it's really worth them filling in the research.
62 suspected immigration offenders arrested. There were studies of local areas where people protested. You can't believe government statistics on immigration. Their campaign is to cause anxiety within the nation. The big debating was so intense as we all tried to make some sense of the mapping immigration conference.